All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to tackle this thing everybody's always talking about, the Myers-Briggs, or MBTI. You know, those 4 letters you see everywhere. We're looking at some excerpts from this website, The Spiritual Seek, and, well, they seem to think the MBTI's got some issues. So today, we're going to figure out what this MBTI thing is all about, how it gets used, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly, and then we'll see if these Spiritual Seek alternatives are really that different. So this Spiritual Seek article, it starts off talking about how the MBTI came to be. Anything in there kind of jump out at you?
You know what I find interesting is that the MBTI, like, it wasn't born in some university lab or anything. Katharine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers, a mother-daughter duo, they're the ones who created it. They were inspired by Carl Jung's ideas, but they wanted to make it, like, actually usable for everyday people.
A mother-daughter team,
Yeah.
creating one of the most, well, famous personality tests out there. That's kind of wild, right?
Totally. And their goal was even more remarkable, I think. They really wanted to help people understand each other better, you know, like reduce conflict and all that, create a more peaceful world. They were living through some crazy times, so they saw this as, like, their contribution.
Wow, so they were aiming high. World peace through personality tests. How'd they even go about doing that?
Well, they took Jung's theories, which are pretty complex, and boiled them down to 4 pairs of preferences. You got extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving. And your personality type, it all comes down to which side of each pair you lean towards. That's how you get those 16 different combinations represented by those 4-letter codes.
Right, like INTJ, ENFP, all those. It's funny how those 4 letters have become like a code. You see them everywhere now, online profiles, jobs, even just casual conversations is like part of your identity now. Do you think there's like actual truth to that? Or is it just, you know, pop psychology hype?
I'd say it's a little of both, honestly. The MBTI can be really useful for self-discovery, figuring out how you interact with the world. You know, it can help you see your strengths, weaknesses, your communication style, how you approach problems and all that. But you got to remember, it's just one lens. It's a good starting point, but it's not the whole story.
So like a roadmap, but not the actual trip.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The real value of the MBTI comes from, like, really exploring those preferences, seeing how they play out in your own life. And that's where some of the criticisms of the MBTI pop up. This article, it points out how easy it is to oversimplify things. Just box people in based on those 4 letters, you know?
Yeah, I can see how just reducing someone to 4 letters could lead to like misunderstandings and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And that brings us to another critique, which is that the MBTI might be a bit too, like, black and white. It's like you're either an introvert or an extrovert, a thinker or a feeler, when really personality is more like a spectrum. You might lean one way, but you're not totally defined by it.
So it's like instead of black and white, it's more like shades of gray.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of reliability. Some people, they take the test again and they get different results. So it makes you wonder, how stable are these preferences over time? Is your personality actually changing, or is the test just, you know, inconsistent?
That makes me think about how much like our environment and experiences can shape how we act, even if our core tendencies stay pretty much the same.
That's a really good point. It really highlights the importance of context. Like, the MBTI focuses on those inherent preferences, but it doesn't really consider how those preferences might shift depending on the situation. For example, someone might be more introverted at work, but then super outgoing with close friends.
Okay, so it's not just about the letters themselves, but how those preferences like play out in real life.
Exactly. And that's kind of where the limits of the MBTI become more obvious. It can be insightful, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't capture, like, the full complexity of human personality.
That makes sense. Now, this Spiritual Seek article, they claim that their tests are better than the MBTI. They go on and on about how they focus on consciousness and inner processing and all that. Do you think they're onto something there?
They definitely emphasize a different angle, that's for sure. But they don't really give you the specifics, you know, like how their tests actually work or why they'd be more accurate. They even say that relying on just one test can be limiting, but then their solution is to offer more tests. It's kind of weird. Like, why would more tests automatically mean you understand things better?
So it's that whole more is better thing, but maybe not in this case.
Right. Quantity doesn't equal quality, you know, and like, yeah, focusing on consciousness and all that sounds kind of cool, but they don't really explain how their tests actually tap into those things.
Seems like they're leaning hard into that whole spiritual vibe, but without actually telling us what makes their approach so special.
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair assessment. We'd need more info to really judge their claims.
Fair enough. Okay, so we've talked about where the MBTI came from, what it's used for, the good, the bad. And we've seen that these spiritual seek alternatives, well, they're not exactly clear yet. What would you say is like the biggest takeaway from all this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the MBTI can be fun. It can get you thinking about yourself, but you gotta avoid oversimplifying things. It's a piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture.
So it's a good starting point, but don't get hung up on the letters. Don't let them define you.
Exactly. Personality's a lot more complex than that, and no single test can capture all of it.
Well said. Now, I'm curious, from all of this, what part of the MBTI stands out to you the most? Is there anything that surprised you or changed your perspective?
What's really fascinating to me is that the MBTI, even with all its flaws, it's had such a huge impact on pop culture. It's become this language people use to understand themselves and connect with others, even if it's not always accurate or, nuanced.
Yeah, it's like this shared cultural thing, even if it's not scientifically perfect.
Exactly. And I think it shows just how much we want to understand ourselves and figure out where we fit in. We're drawn to these frameworks and categories, even if they're imperfect, because they give us a sense of order and meaning.
That makes sense. We all want to belong, to feel understood. And personality tests, even the flawed ones, they give us a way to connect with people who are similar to us.
Totally. It's that feeling of, oh, you're an introvert too. I get it.
Mm.
It creates a sense of connection, a shared experience that can be really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we've covered a lot about the MBTI, its history, what it's good for, what it's bad for. We even looked at those spiritual seek alternatives. But before we go any further, is there anything you think our listeners should keep in mind as we, continue this deep dive?
I think it's important to approach the MBTI with a healthy dose of skepticism and curiosity. It can be a fun way to explore yourself, but don't take it too literally. Don't let it define who you are.
I like that. Skepticism and curiosity. A good mindset for any deep dive.
Yeah.
Now, since we're talking personality, let's shift gears a bit. If you were designing a personality assessment, what would you focus on? What's missing from the MBTI and all these other alternatives? What parts of a person do you think are most important to, really understand?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think one area that often gets overlooked is the role of context and environment. The MBTI, it kind of assumes that your preferences are, pretty much set, but we all know that we might act differently depending on the situation.
Oh, totally. I'm way more reserved to a big networking thing than when I'm just hanging out with close friends.
Exactly. So a truly insightful assessment would have to consider that situational variability,
Yeah.
How do your core tendencies actually show up in different environments, and how do those environments shape your behavior over time?
Yeah, it's our personalities aren't these fixed, unchanging things.
Yeah.
They're dynamic and always interacting with the world around us.
Precisely. Another thing I'd focus on is the why behind our behaviors. The MBTI describes what we prefer, but it doesn't really dig into the motivations or values that drive those preferences. Why are some people drawn to structure and planning while others thrive on spontaneity? What are the deeper needs or fears that kind of influence our decisions?
That's a really good point. It's knowing that I'm an introvert tells me I need alone time to recharge, but it doesn't explain why I need that solitude. What is it about my inner world that makes me crave that space?
Yeah, exploring those deeper motivations could be really eye-opening. It could help us understand not just what we do, but why we do it, which could lead to a much deeper level of self-awareness and personal growth.
It's going beyond just the surface and getting to the heart of who we are.
Exactly. And one final element I'd include is the concept of personal narratives. We all have these stories we tell ourselves about who we are, what we're good at, and what our place in the world is. And these narratives can be super powerful, shaping our beliefs or choices, even how we see reality.
Wow. I've never thought about it like that. But that makes a lot of sense. We're all the main characters in our own life stories.
And a lot of times those stories go unexamined. A really insightful assessment would encourage people to explore those personal narratives. Where did those stories come from? Are they actually helping us? And how can we rewrite those stories if they're holding us back?
That's powerful. Almost like a combo of personality assessment and self-discovery, helping people understand themselves on a much deeper level.
I think that's a really compelling concept. Maybe someday we'll see an assessment that combines all these elements, context, motivation, and personal narratives, to create a truly comprehensive understanding of the individual.
That'd be incredible. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground today. From the history and applications of the MBTI to its, strengths and weaknesses, we've even imagined what a more well-rounded personality assessment could look like. So out of all that, what stands out to you the most?
For me, it's that reminder that personality, even with all our attempts to categorize and label it, it's so fluid and complex. The MBTI and other assessments can be helpful tools, but they shouldn't be seen as like definitive answers or used to limit our potential.
I really appreciate that perspective.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging the nuances and recognizing that we're always evolving.
Yeah.
It's like we said before. It's the journey, not the destination. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you think our listeners should think about when it comes to the MBTI or like personality assessments in general?
I think it's important to remember that these assessments are just that, tools. They can offer insights and starting points for conversations, but they shouldn't dictate your choices or define who you are. Ultimately, you're the author of your own story.
That's a great point to end on. You're the author of your own story. And on that note, it's time for us to come up from this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final question to ponder. If you had to choose one word to describe your own personality, what would it be and why?
That's a tough one. It's really hard to sum up all the different parts of your personality in just one word.
I know, right? It's like trying to squeeze a whole universe into like a tiny little box. But that's what makes it so interesting, I think. It really makes you think about what's at the very core of who you are.
Yeah, for sure. I guess if I had to pick just one, I'd say driven.
Driven. Okay, I like that. Tell me more.
Well, I've always been really motivated to learn new things, to understand things better, to see how ideas connect. And I think that drive is what fuels my passion for exploring different topics and really diving deep into complex stuff like we do here.
Yeah, it definitely shows. You're always looking for that deeper understanding, that's for sure.
And I think that drive, it's something you can apply to any part of life, really, whether it's personal growth, your career, or even just trying to be a more, informed and engaged person in the world.
So it's not just about reaching specific goals, but more about that constant desire to learn and grow as a person.
Exactly. It's about that that inner fire,
Yeah.
that keeps you moving forward, always looking for new knowledge, new experiences.
Love that inner fire. So bringing it back to today's topic, how do you think that drive has shaped your view of the MBTI and all these personality assessments?
I think it's made me really appreciate how valuable these tools can be, as a starting point for exploring yourself. But it's also made me super aware of their limits, It's easy to get caught up in those labels and categories, but you got to remember they can only tell you so much. The real journey of self-discovery, it goes way beyond any test.
That's a great point. It's all about recognizing those nuances and remembering that we're always changing and growing. It's like we said before, it's the journey, not the destination. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you think our listeners should keep in mind when it comes to the MBTI or just personality tests in general?
I'd say just remember that these assessments, they're just tools, They can give you some insights, spark some interesting conversations, but they shouldn't control your choices or define who you are. At the end of the day, you're the one writing your own story.
That's a perfect way to put it. You're the author of your own story. And on that note, it's time for us to come up from this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave you with one last thought. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop learning. And remember, the most fascinating deep dive you can take is the one into your own unique self. See ya on our next adventure.